When the people of Israel returned from exile in Babylon, they were no longer the same. The trauma of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was etched on each of them like a deep scar. They had learned the hard way that straying from God's law had devastating consequences. It was in this context that a group of men emerged who were determined not to allow the people to fall into sin again. They dedicated themselves to studying the scriptures and strictly following the law of Moses. They were the Pharisees, a movement that began with a noble purpose: to preserve Israel's spiritual identity and ensure that they would never be punished by God again. At first, their zeal was sincere, but as the generations passed, something changed. The desire for obedience was replaced by the desire for control. Commitment to the law became a burden imposed on the people. What began as a protective movement turned into rigid legalism, where following rules became more important than seeking God with all their heart. The Pharisees became the most influential religious leaders in Jewish society, especially under Roman rule. They imposed a lifestyle based on the minutiae of the law and created various traditions that they believed helped to maintain the holiness of the people. But when Jesus appeared on the scene, everything began to change. He not only preached about the kingdom of God, but directly challenged the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. On several occasions, he exposed their contradictions and their love of public recognition. For them, holiness was in following rituals and maintaining an impeccable appearance in front of others. For Jesus, true holiness came from the heart. His confrontation with the Pharisees was not just a theological argument, it was a direct threat to the system they had built. The clash grew to such a point that the Pharisees began to see him as a dangerous enemy, someone who needed to be silenced. Despite presenting themselves as guardians of the faith, the Pharisees had turned religion into a public spectacle. They prayed loudly in the squares to be admired, fasted visibly to demonstrate piety, and gave long speeches about the law, but without actually living its principles. Jesus did not hesitate to denounce them. He called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but rotten on the inside. He exposed the incoherence of a system that demanded sacrifices from others, but which, deep down, was driven by pride and vanity. For the Pharisees, following rules was enough. For Jesus, without love and mercy, none of these had any value. The more he spoke, the more the tension grew. The people began to realize that true faith did not lie in repeating traditions, but in transforming the heart. And this infuriated the religious leaders. Not all the Pharisees, however, were blind to this truth. Nicodemus, one of the teachers of the law and a member of the Sanhedrin, began to question himself. There was something different about Jesus. His miracles were real, his words had authority, but admitting this publicly would mean putting his position and reputation at risk. So, one silent night, he decided to seek Jesus out in secret. He wanted to understand who he was. He wanted answers. What he heard in that conversation changed everything. Jesus spoke about the need to be born again, of a spiritual transformation that no rule could guarantee. Nicodemus left without all the answers, but with something new inside him, a restlessness that would never let him see things the same way again. While many Pharisees saw the Christian movement as a threat that needed to be eliminated, one of them stood out for his unexpected stance. Gamaliel, one of the most respected teachers of the law of his time, did not react with fury or a thirst for revenge. Unlike his colleagues, he did not see Jesus' followers as just rebels or heretics. When the apostles were arrested and taken to the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders were determined to put an end to them. The mood in the room was tense, and most wanted severe punishment. But Gamaliel stood up and called for calm. In a firm voice, he reminded everyone that other movements had arisen before and disappeared on their own. If this message were just another human invention, it would end just the same. But if it were something coming from God, Nothing they could do could stop it. He warned that they might be fighting against God himself. His words brought a heavy silence to the room. As determined as most of the Pharisees were to exterminate Jesus' followers, Gamaliel's advice gave them pause. He did not convert to Christianity or become a defender of the faith, but his prudence prevented an even more vicious persecution at that time. The apostles were flogged, threatened, and released, but not executed as many wanted. This did not mean that the conflict between the Pharisees and the Christians was over. On the contrary, the tension would continue to grow. But Gamaliel's words showed that not everyone in the Sanhedrin was blinded by hatred. Some still had the capacity to question whether they were really fighting for what was right. He did not know it at the time, but his words allowed the gospel to continue to spread. While many wanted to stifle the new faith by force, Gamaliel planted a seed of doubt that would linger in the minds of some Pharisees for a long time. If anyone represented the fervor of the Pharisees in their fight against Christians, it was Saul of Tarsus. He was no ordinary Pharisee. He was a man trained at the feet of Gamaliel, a profound expert in the law, and a man completely devoted to Jewish tradition. To him, the followers of Jesus were not just a fractious group. They were a direct threat to the faith of Israel. Saul saw the growth of this movement as an affront to the purity of religion, and he was determined to stamp it out. He became a relentless persecutor. He broke into homes, hauled men and women off to prison, and allowed many of them to be put to death. When Stephen, an early Christian, was stoned to death, Saul was there, approving the execution. His religious zeal blinded him to any possibility that he might be wrong. In his mind, it was a sacred duty to exterminate those who proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah. The more he persecuted, the more he felt he was pleasing God. But everything changed on the road to Damascus. Saul was on a new mission, to arrest more Christians and bring destruction to that city. He set out confidently, with letters of authorization from the religious leaders, certain that he was fulfilling a divine purpose. But halfway there, an intense light enveloped him. Brighter than the sun, it made him fall to the ground, completely disoriented. Then a voice echoed, firm and unmistakable, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He recognized that it was not an illusion, but he could not understand it. "Who are you, Lord?" he asked, and the answer came, direct and overwhelming. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." In that moment, everything Saul believed in collapsed. He who thought he was fighting for God realized that he was fighting against him. When he opened his eyes, he was blind. 3 days without seeing, without eating, without knowing what would happen next. The stalker was now a helpless, broken man, about to have his life changed forever. Saul spent 3 days in darkness, unable to see, unable to eat, and unable to know what was going to happen. Everything he had believed to be true now seemed like a big lie. He, who had seen himself as a defender of God, realized that he was fighting against him. It was in this fragile state that God sent a man named Ananias to find him. Ananias hesitated. After all, Saul was known as a cruel persecutor, someone who would have no mercy on a Christian. But God told him that Saul had been chosen for a new purpose. When Ananias laid his hands on him and prayed, something like scales fell from his eyes. He could see again, but it was not just his physical sight that had been restored. His soul had been transformed. Saul was no longer the same. The man who had breathed threats against Christians now wanted to follow them. He was baptized, and instead of continuing his mission of persecution, he began to preach that Jesus was, in fact, the Son of God. For those who knew him, it was impossible to understand. How could one of the greatest enemies of the Christian faith now be one of its most fervent defenders? Saul's transformation was so radical that he began to be called Paul, as a symbol of the new life he had received. But his conversion was not well received by everyone. Christians themselves were afraid to trust him. Many believed it was a trap, a plan to infiltrate and destroy them from within. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were furious. How could someone who had been an example of zeal for the law now be on the side of those he had fought so hard against? To them, Paul was a traitor, a man who had abandoned tradition and turned against his own people. He no longer belonged to either side. The Christians feared him, and the Pharisees hated him. But that did not stop him. Paul understood that his mission was greater than his reputation. He began to travel, preaching the message he had previously tried to destroy. There was no more pride, no more arrogance, just a man transformed by grace, willing to go to any extreme to bring this truth to the world. Paul's change was not just a matter of belief, it was a definitive break with everything he had known. By choosing to follow Jesus, he knew he was cutting all ties with the world of the Pharisees. Before, he had been respected, a man of influence among the religious leaders. Now, he was seen as a traitor, an enemy of the very faith he had sworn to defend. It was not long before they began to persecute him, just as he had persecuted the Christians before. In Damascus, he barely had time to begin preaching when they tried to kill him. He had to flee in a hurry, being lowered in a basket through an opening in the city wall, and this would be only the first of many persecutions. The one he had previously ordered to be arrested was now the one wanted. In Jerusalem, he faced distrust from Jesus' disciples and the hatred of the Pharisees, but he did not back down. He knew he could no longer live on appearances or try to please people. His faith was now real, and he was willing to pay the price for it. But Paul was not called only to preach to the Jews. His mission went further. While the Pharisees were concerned with maintaining the purity of the law within Israel, Paul was sent abroad. His message was for the Gentiles, those who had previously been seen as impure and unworthy of the divine promise. This generated even more revolt among the religious Jews. For them, true faith was linked to the law of Moses, and the Gentiles had no part in it. But Paul understood that God's grace had no borders. He traveled to pagan cities, preached to Greeks and Romans, and showed that the gospel was not exclusive to one people, but to all humanity. While the Pharisees sought to preserve a religion of appearances, Paul brought a faith that transformed lives. He knew that his choice meant giving up his position, his security, and even his freedom. But there was no turning back. He no longer wanted to be a man respected by men, but a faithful servant of God, whatever the cost. Paul's journey was not marked by earthly glory or recognition, but by imprisonment, beatings, and rejection. Wherever he went, he encountered opposition. To the Pharisees, he was a traitor who distorted the law. To the pagans, he was a madman who preached an invisible God. In several cities he was persecuted, stoned, and expelled. In Philippi he was beaten and thrown into prison. In Lystra he was stoned until they thought he was dead. But none of these trials made him back down. On the contrary, each suffering only strengthened his conviction. While the Pharisees remained focused on maintaining their influence and power within the religion, Paul had nothing but his faith and his mission. He saw suffering not as a punishment, but as part of his calling. After all, Jesus himself had said that his followers would face tribulations. While the Pharisees sought status and recognition, Paul lived in prisons, dependent on the help of fellow believers to survive. But it was in this very environment of deprivation that he wrote some of his most powerful letters, encouraging churches to stand firm, no matter the cost. The contrast between Paul and the Pharisees could not be greater. They remained stuck in tradition, repeating empty rituals, while Paul brought a living message capable of transforming hearts. The Pharisees still sought positions of honor and respect, while Paul considered himself the least of all, a servant of Christ. In the end, history showed who truly understood God's purpose. The Pharisees lost their influence over time. Their religious structure was dismantled with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and their legacy was marked more by rigidity than by genuine faith. Paul, a man who lost everything for the gospel, became one of the most influential figures in Christianity. His letters have been preserved, his words still resonate, and his story continues to inspire millions. In the end, it was not tradition that survived, but the truth that he dedicated his life to proclaiming. The Pharisees spent centuries perfecting their interpretation of the law, creating ever more rigid rules to define who was clean and who was unclean, who was worthy and who should be excluded. But in the process, they missed the essential point. Faith was not about following rules, but about truly knowing God. They had access to the scriptures, memorized the commandments, fasted regularly, and prayed long and hard in public. But they failed to see that the Messiah himself was among them. While they were busy with their traditions, Jesus was healing the sick, freeing the oppressed, and teaching with authority that no written law could replace. But the Pharisees didn't want a Messiah who would challenge their pride. They wanted one who would confirm their importance. So they rejected the truth and fought to silence anyone who challenged their religious dominance. They were blind to what really mattered. When the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the system they had so protected collapsed, and its influence was never the same again. The contrast between the Pharisees and Paul reveals the essence of the gospel. They clung to the law, power, and hierarchy, while Paul gave up everything to follow Christ. The Pharisees feared losing their position. Paul rejoiced in being considered nothing for the love of Jesus. They sought honor among men. Paul considered everything a loss in the face of the knowledge of Christ. In the end, history proved who truly understood God's will. The Pharisees' religiosity died with the destruction of the temple and became just a symbol of what happens when faith becomes mechanical and empty. Paul, who was arrested, beaten, and humiliated, had his message preserved, impacting generations and showing that true faith is not measured by what is displayed in front of others, but by what is lived in the depths of the heart. The big difference between Paul and the Pharisees was their motivation. The Pharisees served religion, a system of rules and traditions that gave them control and status. They believed they were serving God, but in practice they were just defending their own position. Paul, on the other hand, chose to serve God, even if it meant losing everything he had previously achieved. He was no longer bound by a religious system, but by a greater mission, to bring the message of Jesus to the world. For the Pharisees, faith was something that separated them from other people, creating barriers between the pure and the wicked. For Paul, faith was something that united, breaking down barriers between Jews and Gentiles, between slaves and free, between rich and poor. While the Pharisees restricted access to God, Paul proclaimed that salvation was available to all. His life showed that serving God is not about following rituals, but about experiencing real transformation, which changes the way one sees the world and treats the people around them. Their choices left profound marks on history. The religious system that the Pharisees sought to protect disappeared over time. The temple, which was the center of the Jewish religion, was destroyed, and its influence was drastically reduced. Paul, who gave up everything and faced persecution, left a lasting impact. His letters shaped Christianity, his message reached generations, and his faith continues to inspire millions to this day. What seemed like weakness was actually his greatest strength. What seemed like defeat was in fact an eternal victory. In the end, Paul understood what the Pharisees never accepted. God does not care about empty traditions, but about transformed hearts. Time always proves what is true and what is fleeting. The faith of the Pharisees, built on rules and appearances, lost its strength when circumstances changed. They bet all their chips on maintaining a system, but when that system fell, there was nothing left. Paul, who had no temples, wealth, or political influence, left a legacy that has withstood generations. The authentic faith he lived did not depend on external structures, but on a profound internal transformation. He did not need titles or human recognition because his mission came directly from God. He was persecuted, ridiculed, betrayed, and imprisoned, but he never gave up because his faith was stronger than any adversity. His testimony shows that true faith is not a series of rituals or dogmas, but total surrender, a life dedicated to the divine purpose. While the Pharisees tried to protect their reputation, Paul emptied himself of himself so that Christ might be exalted. In the end, the faith of the Pharisees disappeared with their traditions, but Paul's faith has survived the centuries and continues to live on. This story teaches us a valuable lesson: the difference between religiosity and genuine faith. The Pharisees had knowledge, tradition, and zeal, but they did not have a real relationship with God. Paul, on the other hand, experienced a transformation that changed his life forever. This is the big question. It is not about how much one knows about God, but how much one is willing to surrender to Him. We can ask ourselves today, are we living out real faith or just following customs? Are we seeking to please God or to impress others? The contrast between Paul and the Pharisees challenges us to reflect on where our trust really lies. In the end, what remains are not titles, rules, or rituals, but a life that has been truly transformed. The story of Paul and the Pharisees is not just a story of the past, but a mirror for all of us. How often do we care more about rules and appearances than about a real relationship with God? How often do we seek recognition instead of transformation? Empty religiosity still exists, disguised as rituals, traditions, and well-crafted speeches that do not touch the heart. The call that Paul received in Damascus is the same one that echoes for each of us: to abandon pride, leave behind everything that does not have eternal value, and live an authentic faith. This does not mean giving up principles or truth, but understanding that the true walk with God is not based on following rules to be accepted, but on being transformed by the love of Christ. Like Paul, we are invited to abandon old certainties and embrace a new life, not built on our own merits, but on the grace of God. In the end, the big difference between Paul and the Pharisees was what each chose to hold on to, and what they chose to let go of. The Pharisees held on to their tradition, their position, and their reputation, but they lost the essentials. Paul, on the other hand, gave it all up, and in doing so gained something much greater: a life with eternal purpose. That is the choice before us all. What are we willing to lose in order to gain something truly worthwhile? History proves that what is built on pride and religiosity does not last, but what is founded on true faith endures through generations. The Pharisees' temple was destroyed, but Paul's faith lives on. In the end, it is not how righteous one seems in the eyes of others, but how much one has been transformed in the eyes of God.